Here we go, 10.1, an introduction to muscles. I know you're thinking about your upcoming test, but I want you to have just a little bit of background on muscles so that we can start in a good place after your test on next week. So in muscles, I want to introduce you to just a few concepts here. One, what are some properties of muscle tissue? And when we say muscle, are we talking tissue? Are we talking organ? What does muscle do besides producing movement? And how is a skeletal muscle put together? And more specifically, we're going to talk about the muscle fiber, which is the same thing as a muscle cell. And you'll see that'll make more sense to you in just a minute. So, muscle is a tissue that has properties that we associate with it that are pretty important. It is electrically excitable, which means it can be stimulated. That's important because muscle will not contract unless it gets a signal. Muscle is contractible, which means it gets shorter, and that's important. So muscle can squeeze or muscle can pull on things like bones. It's extensible, which means it can be slightly stretched, and that's important for our range of motion. And muscle is elastic. Once it is stretched, it can come back to its original form and its original shape. So these are all important properties of muscle. Now, again, something like nervous tissue is also electrically excitable, but these four distinguish muscle. And by the way, when you see these terms myo or myes or sarco, they all refer to muscle or muscle tissue. If you see a term like epimysium or sarcoplasm or sarcolemma, these are terms that are often refer to muscle-related anatomy and physiology. So we understand that muscles help us move. We got that. What are some other important functions of muscle besides movement? Muscle does provide some protection for internal organs. Think about your abdominal muscles protecting your abdominal organs, for example. Muscle helps us generate heat. As muscle tissue uses energy, it does produce heat as a byproduct. That's important for homeostasis, right? We have to have a certain temperature at which we best operate, what our enzymes best operate as, for example. So generating heat is another important property of muscle. As we've just discussed with our joint chapter, muscle is important for stabilizing joints. The tendons and muscle itself that runs across joints helps stabilize them. And again, a great example is the hip. Muscle is important for helping us maintain our posture and body position. We don't think about, as we're sitting up, all the slight little adjustments that have to occur, that are occurring, so we don't just flop over. Muscles are actually helping us, sending slight contractions and slight corrections so that as we shift position, we don't fall over. That's an important property. And for certain muscles, like smooth muscles, we're going to see how it facilitates or hinders the passage of materials. We'll have muscles that are going to be, here we go, that are going to be called sphincters. That if they're open, stuff passes through, and if they're closed, stuff doesn't pass through. We'll see that with blood vessels, and we'll see that with some of our hollow organs. And of course, cardiac muscle is going to be important. Its contraction for pushing blood through the heart. So before we get into before we get into a couple of ideas with just some basic muscle cell structure, I want to make sure you're clear on this. Muscle tissue, like you see here, is not the same thing as a skeletal muscle. A skeletal muscle, like a biceps brachii in this case, is an organ. And that might seem odd because you think of organs like a pancreas or the heart, but what's the definition of an organ? An organ is going to contain multiple kinds of tissue for a common function. So a biceps brachii in this case is going to contain muscle tissue, check. It's also going to contain nervous tissue. It's also going to contain connective tissue. It's also going to contain interactions with those, and we'll get to that in just a second. So a skeletal muscle, like you see here, is an organ. Muscle tissue is a big part of that, but muscle tissue and muscle, the organs, are not quite the same thing. Hopefully you see the difference. A person who plays the flute in the orchestra is not the orchestra. She is a part of the orchestra. Okay, so How is muscle organized? First, let me give you an analogy. And this it'll make more sense hopefully in a minute. This is a drinking straw. The drinking straw is wrapped in a paper wrapper. A box of these wrapped straws. You see the box here, but then I can have a crate of the boxes, a crate of the boxes of the wrapped straws. What am I trying to get at here? When we look at the anatomy of a muscle fiber and then the skeletal muscle, you see a very similar kind of arrangement. This thing here sticking out is called a muscle fiber. That is a muscle cell. I know it's slightly confusing because we think of a cell as a cell, but actually in this case, a muscle cell is called a muscle fiber. A muscle fiber is wrapped in its own loose connective tissue called an endomysium. There's the word "mise." So we have wrapped around a muscle fiber, a muscle cell, an endomysium. We have a group of these, here we go. So we have this one and this one and this one and this one and this one. These are a group of muscle fibers. They're going to be wrapped in a container, in a connective tissue called a paramysium. This whole thing sticking out here, this whole unit, if you will, this piece, is called a fascicle. If you want to think of this as the box. Okay, well, then I have a group of fascicles, because here's going to be one, here's one, here's one, here's one. These are all wrapped in a connective tissue layer called the epimysium. And in this part of our analogy, this was the big crate that was holding the individual boxes, which was holding the individual wrapped straws. That's why I gave you that analogy. And to me, that analogy makes perfect sense. Maybe it doesn't to you. But a muscle fiber is the straw. The wrapping around it is the endomysium. The box of straws is called a fascicle because the box is made up of, in this case, the paramysium, but a bunch of boxes put in the same crate. The crate would be the epimysium because now we have all of these wrapping all of these, wrapping all of this. So that is the basic organization of a skeletal muscle. Muscle fibers wrapped in endomysium, multiple muscle fibers are wrapped together to form a fascicle wrapped by a paramysium, and then wrapped, if you will, the crate is going to be the epimysium. And so this connective tissue you see here is going to be continuous with a tendon, and tendons, of course, connect muscles to bone. There's going to be, and I mentioned this in class, an aponeurosis, which is going to be a broad, flat tendon. We'll come up to, we'll discuss those later on as well. So don't think all tendons look like this. Some tendons are going to be long, flat sheets, and we'll get to those soon. Okay, so again, muscle fiber is a muscle cell wrapped in an endomysium, wrapped in a paramysium, wrapped in an epimysium, and all of this together is the skeletal muscle made up of, I'm having cursor issues, made up of the individual muscle fibers, which are muscle cells. That's why I wanted you to see this video before class. Okay? So this is showing you one single muscle cell, i.e. a muscle fiber that's shown individually here. So even though you see little things in here, this is not the same thing as you're seeing here. Okay, if I could zoom in, zoom in, zoom in on that thing, this is what I would see. This is a muscle cell. That is a muscle fiber. What do cells have? Cells are going to have a nucleus. They're going to have cytoplasm. They're going to have a membrane. They're going to have all the things that you know and love about cells. This cell has the same thing. It has a nucleus. Oh, wait. And a nucleus. And a nucleus. Yeah, muscle fibers, muscle cells, are multinucleate. When we're embryos, hundreds of cells fuse together to form a muscle cell. So muscle cells actually, as adults, when we're an adult, are going to be multinucleate. The nucleus, again, helps us produce proteins. And as you imagine, there's going to be a lot of protein associated with muscle. We're going to find in this case, a cell membrane. It's called a sarcolemma in this case, because it's a muscle membrane, a sarcolemma. We're going to find in between all these little pieces in here, cytoplasm, but in this case, we call it sarcoplasm. And then we find all of these little individual pieces sticking out here. These actually are called myofibrils. These are organelles. They don't look like organelles. They look like sticks sticking out there, but those are units of proteins that are called myofibrils. So myofibril is a piece of a muscle fiber. And it's unfortunate the names sound kind of similar, but a myofibril is one of these pieces, a protein arrangement, if you will, that makes up the muscle fiber. If I zoom in here, and we're almost done, is we're going to see the proteins shown in this drawing. You see, I'm having a hard time with my cursor. Hang on, where is it? Can't find, there it is. Okay, so you see these parts that look kind of red, and then these parts that look kind of purple and clear, and these parts that look kind of red, and these parts that look kind of purple and clear. We talk about skeletal muscle being striated. Striated means striped, and it's the appearance, the striped appearance is because of the arrangement of these proteins. They'll be a little clearer when we get to class. Let me show you a couple more, and then we'll be done. But here you sort of see it blown up, where we see this protein, this big, fat, thick protein is called myosin, and these thinner purple proteins that kind of stick through here, kind of around them, that's called the thin filament or actin. So the myofibril, one of these little pieces of the muscle fiber, has these proteins, actin and myosin, in this arrangement that gives us the striped appearance. So this part here corresponds to this part. And because you have very little protein here, it looks clearish. When you come over here, and if you were to kind of zoom down this section, you're going to see thin and thick and thin and thick and thin and thick proteins kind of lying like this on top of one another. So that looks dark. So when we see that, we see, again, the appearance of a striped pattern. And this will be a little clearer in class. But I really needed you to see actin and myosin. These proteins are going to be key, critical, hugely important to how muscle contracts. Okay, so as we wrap up, I just want to show you this one last picture. Okay, so this is again showing you the muscle, the organ. They have pulled out for you a muscle fiber that is a muscle cell. They have pulled out of the muscle cell one of the myofibrils, one of these pieces. And of these pieces, they're trying to show you here, again, the actin and myosin by showing you the striped part, the clearish part, the striped part, and the clear part. And we'll get to this term sarcomere in class. And the key to all of this, and I'm going to spoil a surprise, is called a sliding filament theory. The proteins are going to slide past one another, and that's going to be how the muscle gets shorter and how it contracts. So I'll just leave you with these questions that we're going to be exploring in class. Here we go. So important questions. How does myosin, how does one of these proteins pull actin? That's going to be important for us to look at. What happens to the whole muscle when it shortens? And probably the biggest, most important question, the one you're asking yourself right now, is why again am I taking A&P? This is a muscle introduction. Really, you may have to watch this twice so you can really kind of get it, but you need to be able to talk your way down in terms of organization, all the way from a skeletal muscle all the way down to actin and myosin are part of myofibrils. A myofibril is part of a muscle fiber. A muscle fiber is part of a skeletal muscle. If you understand the organization, you're going to be in pretty good shape for lecture. Good luck with your studying. Let me know if you have any questions, and we're done.